The US is the enemy of the West, says the Financial Times. No FT, no comment. And the charge of the woke brigade assembles in London, where Sir Keir Starmer has given little Zelensky £4 billion in 2 days. And this is the land where there's a big black hole in our public finances, which meant that our old age pensioners had to shiver through this winter. And Keir Starmer announces he'll be putting British boots on the ground and planes in the air. Though, as Colonel Douglas Macgregor pointed out immediately afterwards, that would mean World War III. Well, it's all coming up this evening, because this is the mother of all talk shows. Stay tuned. I wonder how you saw the events in the Oval Office. There seems to be a peculiar dichotomy. Western liberals who've now expelled your country from the West and who believe they are the world were scandalized, shocked, like the police captain in Casablanca when he discovered there was gambling going on in Rick's Cafe. And most American people who kind of thought that Zelensky got what he had coming. What was your take?
Well, I got to say, I was just absolutely shocked. I was literally 90 seconds from going on the air with the show we had prepared when my producer, Gary, saw the images of, on the side, because he'd been monitoring it, and he saw this argument going on. And so we immediately cut our show and just went with what was going on almost live as we were talking about it. And I just couldn't believe what I was seeing, because especially when I went back and watched the whole thing in context and watched the last few minutes, as leading into it. I did a deep dive on this whole issue and how it came about. And you can see very clearly the United States had no intention of having any kind of an explosion going on there. In fact, all they wanted to do was just have a signing ceremony and move on to whatever's next. Apparently, they didn't even want to have him in the White House for that. That was something that Zelensky himself really pressed for because of the optics. And then when you see him actually bait the vice president, and then he just kept on going. Then after it went to the president, he just kept going. He would not shut up. He just kept his mouth going, causing more of this rift. Now, what I also did in a show I did earlier today, actually, especially after he went with Sir Keir Starmer and some of the comments that he made there, what I have observed is there is this huge absence of knowledge about what's actually at stake here. You have people who already didn't like Trump, who were just beside themselves, both in the U.S. and in Europe, who were just going crazy about it and just saying they were embarrassed, they were ashamed, how undiplomatic, etc. And if you already didn't like Zelensky, then you thought that Trump and Vance made the right call. But something you said just a second ago before we came on the air here, I think is missed by so many people. This guy, forget about the $500 billion that he's in debt to the West or whatever, but his lifeblood is on the line here. And if he doesn't have the United States backstop, even Starmer himself said if the U.S. doesn't backstop these alleged peacekeeping troops that he wants to put into Ukraine, he said it's not going to work. Trump absolutely said we're not going to do that. And so to then insult the president of the United States and vice president on the very floor, the Oval Office of the symbol of American power in the White House, and think that there's not going to be a negative reaction is just baffling to me, because he is basically, Zelensky is playing with the lives of his people. Because, George, I'll tell you the one thing that nobody seems to understand, or at least not many in the West. The war is already decided. It's only the only thing still to determine is how bad the loss will be for Ukraine. Zelensky refused to negotiate, refused to administer the Minsk Accords. He refused the December 2021 offer that Putin gave again to avoid war. He refused the Istanbul meetings. He refused the June 2024 opportunity, and he's refusing the one now. He is the biggest impediment to peace, quantifiably, and he continues to send his men out every day to pointlessly die in a war that cannot be won, and people still have the audacity to suggest that Trump did something wrong, who expressly said, I want the killing to stop. If anybody cares about the people of Ukraine, it's Donald Trump.
First of all, let me get a Russian perspective from your side. What did you pick up in Moscow about the scenes in Washington that happened this week. Laughter, joy, tears, disbelief, or all of them?
Well, George, you can imagine it's been a mixture of all three. I'm, reminded of the term. It's a German term. It's a beautiful word in the German language, Schadenfreude, which essentially translates into, it's hard to describe it, but it translates into sort of, reveling in the sort of distress of an enemy. Now, there's less of that than you would have imagined in Moscow. I think the first response was abject shock. I mean, nobody expected this. After the toing and froing with Zelensky, he will sign, he won't sign, President Trump's dictator comments, or did I call him that? So people were sort of expecting a rapprochement between the two, that a PR exercise would be pushed over the line in order to get something from this deal, this minerals deal, which is a paper tiger in many ways. And interestingly, just prior to this meltdown in the Oval Office, Donald Trump had made a very interesting comment on Fox Radio. It wasn't that widely publicized, but he had said, look, we don't know what's in Ukraine. We don't know how much minerals are there. We don't know, do they have any minerals at all? But at least it's something. It's going to get us something back, so we're going to kind of pursue it. He sounded kind of tired at that stage. Now, remember, very senior officials had gone to Kiev and had been screamed at, apparently, by Zelensky, to the dismay of the regime there. And it culminated in this trip. The view here is one of, amazement, but not surprise. I saw a very good meme, which I posted on my X, of Donald Trump calling Vladimir Putin and saying he's completely insane. And President Putin saying, yeah, told you, kind of thing. So there's a kind of a sense here in Russia that, and we told you so, that it's very difficult to deal with this individual, that he's not a statesman. And everything that you know in the West about Volodymyr Zelensky, of course, has been manufactured. This manufactured Churchillian figure. And you and I, as people who've studied history, know that Volodymyr Zelensky, whatever you think about Churchill, I'm an Irishman, and I'd have problems with Winston Churchill, but you can't argue that the man was a giant of international politics. He loved his country, even though he may have been a very flawed individual. To sort of portray Volodymyr Zelensky as a Churchillian figure, as soon as you heard that, people should have sat up and said, there's something wrong here. The man is essentially an accelerated stooge of an oligarch, Ihor Koyminsky. And I've written this week long passages about this, particularly for the American audience, to introduce them to who this man really is. And in Russia, people are very well educated politically. They want to talk about politics. So there's been a sense of shock. There's now a sense of, well, we've told you so, but what happens next? And what's important about this, I think, from here, from this side of the pond, if you like, is how Europe is reacting, how Europe is scurrying around in this vacuum trying to portray some sort of plausibility to the war, that they're so far up this war, the pipe of this war, people like von der Leyen, such investment in political capital, in fiscal capital, in the self-harm sanctions that have destroyed and degraded the beating heart of Europe's economy, Germany, the amount of political careers that have failed as a result of this utterly foolhardy support of the war. That is how the Europeans are going to try to cobble together some sort of plausibility to continuing this war, while the Americans, this Leviathan, and we all know when America motivates itself to get behind somebody, it's very hard to defeat them. Ask the Japanese. How are they going to sort of maintain this, utterly false facade of plausibility around a war which can't be won militarily, and is being essentially fronted by a grossly corrupt regime which is brutalizing its own people? That's the sense here. What happens next, particularly with an eye on Europe?
Well, look, blimey, Daniel, that's another outstanding debut call. That's two new calls that have been amongst the best that I have heard on here. I'm coming to Los Angeles in September with Gayatri, God willing. We're probably in the Anaheim area, we'll be speaking. So if you're around, Daniel, please come and see us. It's absolutely the case that the Crimean War was an invasion of Russia by Britain and France. History doesn't repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes. And Britain and France also invaded the very same Russia in 1918. Between 1918 and 1922, Britain and France had hundreds of thousands of invading soldiers in Russian territory, trying to interfere in Russia's internal affairs. In fact, the French held Odessa, and the Russians took it back. And personally, I think they'll take it back again. So you would have thought that a somber appreciation of history would lead you to the following conclusion. It was a very bloody and costly war for us to fight Russia in the middle 19th century, since when Russia has become a hypersonically armed nuclear superpower, which has an armed forces that completely dwarf all of ours, that has a military industrial complex which produces 4 times the amount of ours combined amongst all our countries, 4 times greater. So 4 tanks for every tank, 4 shells for every shell, and 4 airplanes for every one. You can gross it up and see. You would think it is sobering experience to contemplate that and to conclude that perhaps another charge of the Light Brigade is not the wisest idea. Well, that's all there is to say, and you said it in a way that nobody else could. It's the best call of the night, best call of many a night. And I'm very glad that you did make the call, and your hatred and detestation of the British political class and the media class, and you're a man who forgave the guy who murdered his father. It's difficult to forgive our politicians because they're trying to murder everybody's son. Yeah, I mean, look, it's perfectly apparent, but I want to make it clear. I did not, in fact, say that Zelensky was a Nazi.
No.
I said that there are plenty of Nazis in powerful, influential positions inside his regime, and no one can deny that. I just reposted a piece from the Jerusalem Post about the naming of a street in Kiev after a Nazi SS butcher of Jews and Poles and Slavs of varying nationalities. And no one can deny that. That was in the Jerusalem Post, and the street is there for anybody to see. And the idea, as Morgan tried to spin it, that there's only a handful of Nazis in Ukraine, well, this just so flies in the face of the truth. You've got to conclude that it's a deliberate attempt to deceive. The big story this evening is that Zelensky has changed his mind again. He's in the grip of a kind of schizophrenia, and he may well have sold the same mineral rights twice to 2 entirely different partners. It looks as if he signed in the 100-year deal. How absurd and vainglorious is that? A 100-year treaty. I've got it sitting on my desk. I'm looking very carefully at some of the clauses, Keir Starmer. If you imagine that your 100-year treaty is going to silence me, you don't know me at all. But in the 100-year deal, it's clear that Zelensky has sold the mineral rights in the western part of Ukraine, I'll come back to that point in a minute, to Keir Starmer, which presumably explains the largesse being lavished by the British Exchequer on the little coke sniffer. £8 billion pounds sterling has been given by Keir Starmer to Zelensky since Starmer became Prime Minister not even a year ago, not even 9 months ago. 8 billion in 9 months is pretty good going. But then there might have been gold in them there hills, or at least minerals, and Starmer had secured the rights to them, except having refused in the White House to sign a deal giving the same minerals to the United States, having been thrown out of the White House, almost physically ordered off the premises, refusing to sign the mineral agreement, Zelensky has now said in a letter to Donald Trump, which actually is a tweet. The postal services are so last century. I mean, snail mail, forget it. Send a tweet between one president and the other, totally capitulating and saying that you're coming back, you want to come back, having said that you will never go back, having been told by President Trump you'll never be allowed back. Now he wants back in the White House. But he wants Macron and Starmer to go with him. Maybe like, a couple who've adopted him, his guardians. Macron and a man, I know it's hard to believe, but Starmer and Macron were ready to go, or at least until this afternoon when Macron denied that he was going to go. So it looks like only Starmer wants to accompany little Zelensky back to the White House, where he will sign over the exact same minerals he's already sold to the British to the United States of America. Meanwhile, Donald Trump has scrapped the intelligence sharing agreement that he had with Ukraine. The United States has 8,000 plus satellites orbiting the battlefield right now. Most of them, incidentally, owned by Elon Musk, a member of Donald Trump's government. And those satellites are now switched off for Ukraine, which means Ukraine has no idea of Russian troop movements, whether the Russians are moving up somewhere or not. You cannot fight a war without that kind of intelligence, and Zelensky now doesn't have it. Neither does he have any more American weapons, which have been halted at the depots in which they were being stored, ready to be shipped in. The Germans have declared that they have no more weapons left to give to Ukraine. If Vladimir Putin's thinking of restaging Berlin 1945, this would appear to be a good time to do it, as the Germans have run out of ammunition. The Poles have made it clear that they will not be sending any forces to the Ukraine. The Italians, having agreed at the weekend to do so, have now declared that they are retreating. Who would have thunk it? An Italian government, an Italian army leaving the field so soon. So it's us and the French. Except it's not even us and the French. Those of you who know anything about French military prowess since the Napoleonic era know that the French army, well, to put it kindly, cannot be relied upon. And the lads that had to be lifted off the beach at Dunkirk and their sons and daughters could tell you more about that. Can I start with Gaza? The situation will quickly become absolutely critical again, now that there's no food, no water, no power, no medicine, no hospitals standing, and Israel has slammed shut the gates and begun killing people again. Will the Arab plan stop that?
Well, if the Arab plan were implemented, which seems to be reasonable on its face, then presumably so. But the main issue, I don't think, is whether the Arab plan itself is viable, but rather that there's no point in rebuilding Gaza if Israel is simply going to destroy it again. We've seen the same thing after the 2014 war, for example, which I chronicled in the documentary Killing Gaza. And there was a plan to rebuild Gaza, much of which did not materialize. And Israel destroyed Gaza again, and in the last year and a half has reduced it to a pile of rubble. So this is the real impediment to any kind of positive, hopeful outcome in the Gaza Strip.
Well, that's one caveat. The other is that Donald Trump has already rejected it. What do the Arab kings and presidents and generals, what do they do next?
I don't think they really have much of a play. I mean, they've offered up a proposal that, as you correctly said, Donald Trump has rejected essentially on behalf of Israel, which he appears to be taking Israel's side completely on this. And there are no good answers for this completely intolerable situation of permanent siege, permanent occupation, constant bombing, starvation of the Gaza Strip, other than an actual negotiated outcome in which the siege is lifted, the principal demands that Hamas laid out right after, I mean, even previous to October 7th, that it has consistently laid out, that Gaza needs to be free. It needs to be able to live. It needs to be able to rebuild, and it needs a guarantee of a ceasefire without Israel coming to destroy it, commit mass murder, and reduce it to rubble once again. And unless that is the core of the agreement, then it's essentially pointless.
Will they, won't they, will they, won't they, will they join the dance? Zelensky, looking like a man in the middle of his 19th nervous breakdown, has changed his mind again. He wasn't going to negotiate with the Russians, and that was only a couple of hours ago. Now he is, under the strong American leadership that he walked out on under a cloud just a few days ago. And the big war leader, Keir Starmer, who was raising the flag of a European revolt against the United States just at the weekend, has now run it down again. Will there be any kind of talks? Will there be any kind of end to the war in Ukraine? And the Arabs have pitched their tent in Gaza and told Donald Trump to back off. They're going to spend $35 billion, they say, rebuilding Gaza without the Palestinians having to move. Trump has already rejected it. We are on these big stories and many others tonight on the mother of all talk shows. You don't want to miss it. Stay tuned. You saw it all last night. I was impressed by Trump, got to tell you. His command of the situation, his levels of confidence, and his complete domination of the American political scene right now. Is that how you saw it?
Absolutely. I mean, Donald Trump handled the audience amazingly well. That level of opposition that he faced, where you had Alan Green, the U.S. member of Congress from Texas, waving his cane. They had to stop the speech so he could be escorted out. I mean, you have to look on at this and shake your head. George W. Bush invaded Iraq, lied about weapons of mass destruction. The invasion of Iraq led to the death of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, thousands of U.S. soldiers. And when he spoke before Congress with his State of the Union speeches, Democrats stood up for him every time. They gave him standing ovations. But Donald Trump, who's taken office once again and might, God forbid, want to end the war in Ukraine, was met with cold silence and disruptions. The Democratic Party is really bankrupt. And Donald Trump used this speech to just steamroll right over them. He even used their catchphrase. He said one of his goals was to provide, quote, immediate relief to working families. Now, that phrase, working families, that was a phrase that was popularized by the labor movement in the United States during the 1990s. Polling showed that in the United States, the phrase working class doesn't really go over. Americans tend to always say they're middle class. And the word working class, people think of communism or it's vulgar or something like that. But the labor unions discovered in the 1990s that if they talked about working families, that people responded very positively. They think of families working hard, struggling to pay their bills, a hardworking father providing for his kids, etc. And so, the labor unions here in New York State, they started the Working Families Party, which is the second ballot line for the Democrats, etc. And working families was a Democrat Party phrase until recently, because now the wokeification of the Democratic Party has decided that the phrase working families is somehow anti-LGBT. And I don't understand how that works. As far as I'm concerned, LGBT people have families. So I don't know where they're getting this from, but the Democrats are no longer talking about working families. So Donald Trump usurped one of their key phrases. This was an epic victory for Trump. I will say I have my concerns about some of what he said, but as far as a political victory, it was a knockout in one round.
3.2 million people saw and interacted with my tweet just the other day, not even 2 days ago, not more than 2 days ago, in which I stated that my one military-aged child, my eldest son, will be removed from the country by me before I'll let Keir Starmer get his dirty hands on him. And a lot of people agree with that. That's why I've launched this No Conscription League. It'll have its own Twitter handle soon, but you can get more details at Workers' Party of Britain. Well, look, Lance, a religion cannot be native to any land. There are Chinese Jews. I've met them. There are Vietnamese Jews. I've met them. They're not native to the land of Palestine. There are African Jews. They're not native to the land of Palestine either. There are Ashkenazi Jews who are entirely European in their DNA. That's why you're not allowed to have a DNA test in Israel, because it will reveal that virtually none of them are Semitic, virtually none of them have any ancestral connection to the land. As a Roman Catholic, I have no right at all to the land of any other Roman Catholic anywhere in the world. Even to state that proposition demonstrates its complete absurdity. You can convert to Judaism. I'm wearing a hat. The reason I'm wearing a hat is because I was viciously assaulted. I was viciously assaulted by a manager in the BBC who had recently converted to Judaism. Now, it's fine. I love all religions. But you can't say I've now converted to Judaism and therefore I have a right to go to the land of Palestine and live in the house of someone whose ancestors have been living in it for thousands of years. Again, merely to state that truth is to demonstrate the absurdity of the propaganda to which you allude, to which you refer. Well, of course, I'm familiar with that argument. It's partly true, but the gas reserves don't just belong to Palestine. A very significant part of the field belongs to the Israeli state. Still more belongs to Cyprus, Lebanon, Syria. They all share their share of the basin that contains all this gas. So the United States companies now will dominate the industry in all of these other countries. It will be US majors that do the drilling and will own the reserves in all of those countries, and including Gaza. The Palestine Authority would definitely sign an agreement with the Americans to allow them to exploit the gas off the coast of Gaza. The secondary point is that as a matter of law, these resources that lie off the coast of Gaza belong to the Palestinian people, and that is a matter of law recently adjudicated again by the International Court of Justice in The Hague. But you may say the law is an ass, doesn't matter a fig, you can break it at will. and that's true. But companies could be sued in multiple jurisdictions for illegally harvesting gas that belongs to the Palestinian people off the coast of Gaza. Governments which allowed it could be sued in their own jurisdictions. And these things would all be very troublesome indeed. So you're right in part, but I wouldn't hang your hat on that point, if you'll forgive me. If you look at that X vote, so 6,350 people voted on X. 8% of them said they support conscription for Ukraine. So it's a small percentage, but it's a big number. So 10% would have been 635. So let's call it more than 500 people on X support conscription for Ukraine. So your country needs you. Where's your tin hat? Get your bag, get your gun, and go. Why don't you? Gutless cowards.
Exactly. So SDF says, ambiguous questions in these times, George. Do you mean conscription of Brits to go to Ukraine, or just dragging Ukrainian people into vans while they're walking their little dog, like little Zelensky is doing already?
Well, as you know, neither you nor me draw up these polls, and there is an ambiguity there, but it might actually be a deliberate ambiguity. I don't support the brutal conscription of Ukrainian youth. I say youth, they're about to reduce it to 14. There's a bill before the Rada now to reduce the conscription age in Ukraine to 14, and it's already 18 to 60. So it'll be 14 to 60. And you know the reason for that? There are millions, 9 millions of Ukrainians living, many of them living the life of Riley, outside of Ukraine, demonstrating for your son to go and fight in Ukraine while they are draft dodging in your country. Go figure. It was a massacre of the minorities, and helpfully, you may think, the mass murderers filmed themselves whilst doing it. During Ramadan, with grins all over their faces, they hunted down and gunned down men and women, young and old. The only common characteristic, all unarmed. Such tough guys, these head-chopping, heart-eating, fanatic Islamist extremists are. They're very good at cutting the heads off people whose hands are tied behind their back and who cannot fight them back. They're very good at murdering women, although they like to keep their women locked away, and they like to keep the women they stole from other people locked away. Yazidi women, for example. They are big on women's modesty, but that doesn't stretch to not murdering them in their homes. Helpfully, you may think they've filmed themselves doing it. Therefore, the culpability cannot be shared. The culpability cannot be obscured. They had their patches, ISIS and Al-Qaeda patches, on their arms. They were chanting obscenely the name of God whilst they murdered people in cold blood, many hundreds of them, maybe thousands of them. And yet, this massacre of the minorities in Syria over the last few days is virtually unreported on Western media, particularly in those countries that did the most to put these maniacs into power, to usher the black flags of ISIS and Al-Qaeda into Damascus. Their media, so tightly controlled, they're not even reporting a massacre of Christian people, of Alawi people, of Shia and Druze people by their clients, by their agents, by the people they armed and funded. David Lammy gave £50 million to these people just last week. The British Foreign Secretary gave £50 million of your money. Do you know what for? To help them build an inclusive government. Inclusive government. Well, that inclusive government's gunmen just massacred the people that London presumably was referring to as those that needed to be included. The United States is the only country in the Western world that has roundly condemned the massacre and has attributed to the people who took the videos. You hear what I'm saying? They took the videos. The United States presidency attributed it to the Islamist fanatics of HTS, the rebrand of Al-Qaeda in Syria, and their ISIS allies. The European Union, on the other hand, did not mention the people who took the videos and blamed the minorities for getting themselves massacred. It was community noted on Twitter within half an hour, but it still stands extant as the European Union's position on the massacre of hundreds, if not thousands, of people. The legendary white helmets are already in, cleaning up. I've got a picture on my phone of the white helmets picking up the corpses, dumping them in skips to take them away, just in case there's any international observer remotely interested in finding out what happened. But of course, so far, there are none. The European Union backed HTS and the mass murderers. The United States condemned the mass murderers. The British government, on the other hand, has said nothing at all. Least of all, asking for its £50 million back, now that we know that the idea of an inclusive government in Syria has just been drowned in blood. The front-runner for Romanian President Georgescu has again been banned by the Romanian authorities. It is a second coup d'etat to cheat the people of Romania of their democratic rights, and it is all being done under the direction of Brussels, von der Leyen and the EU. Either the Supreme Court in Romania will have to reverse this decision, or the people will have to remove the regime in Romania. And the massacre of the minorities in Syria, Christians, Druze, Alawi, Shia, are being massacred in their hundreds, if not thousands, and the world remains completely silent. In Kursk, the worst British military disaster since the Norway debacle is underway. I say British because the British planned every single bit of Zelensky's incursion into the Kursk salient in Russia, and in the United States, in Washington, even in the Capitol building. They're roaming around with guns, and they're gunning for President Trump. It's all coming up this evening on the mother of all talk shows. Now, Ron Paul and yourself have been strong supporters of the new Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. She almost didn't get confirmed because of her stance on the so-called Syrian revolution. She was called an Assad puppet, a Putin puppet, because she repeatedly warned of the character of the people that Western policy was driving to power in Damascus. Those critics look rather foolish today, don't they, Daniel?
Yes, to us they do, but unfortunately most of the world media at least still is writing it as Assad remnants, regime remnants have risen up and attacking the new democratic government. But absolutely, Tulsi Gabbard was right from the very beginning. She went to Syria with Representative Kucinich at the time to see what was going on, a fact-finding tour. That's the last time we were close to war after the false flag chemical attack, as you very well remember, George. She's proven to be absolutely correct. It should be a no-brainer. You shouldn't be training, equipping jihadists. You shouldn't be training and equipping Al-Qaeda and using them to form your governments. Exactly what we did in Libya, as you mentioned in your previous section. We did the exact same thing, and it tore the country apart. I find the timing very interesting, George, that it was in late December that Assad finally fell, was pushed. It's around the time that Israel was getting a real shellacking by Hezbollah in Lebanon and by Hamas in Gaza, despite the fact that they flattened the place, they were taking really unsustainable losses. And now you have an absolute chaos unleashed in Syria and a backlash where Professor Syed put a post up on X earlier today saying it may be 10,000 Alawites and Christians who've been slaughtered over the last couple of days in Syria. I wouldn't be surprised. I've seen video, George. I'm sure you have as well. It is absolutely sickening.
Yeah, we're a very, very long way away from that. So when you say in the final form, I hope you don't mean that we are in the last days, because we're not in the last days of Israel. We're not in the last days of American empire. We may have reached the last era, the last period, and the signs of decay and rot are everywhere and are irreversible. That is true. But it takes an empire quite a long time to fall. And before it's done, it continues to have very serious teeth and claws and nuclear, thermonuclear claws at that. So it's a long time before your formulation of Mandela's Law, which is a very good idea of yours. Anyone guilty of genocide has to give territorial concessions to the victims of their genocide. But that will not be seen by you or me or our children or our grandchildren. I'm, I suppose, having to play the role here of pessimism of the intellect. Optimism of the will is indispensable, and I possess it in abundance. I spend all of my day, every day, in my 70th year, optimistic in my will. But pessimism of the intellect is equally important. Otherwise, it leads to adventurism. Otherwise, I get people, for example, all the time saying to me, what we need is the downfall of the Labour government and a general strike. Well, the Labour government was elected 9 months ago and has a majority in Parliament of 174. It is not possible to bring it down, to knock it out of office. And general strike, have you seen the trade unions? The trade unions are actually, in civil society, amongst the most active tail enders of NATO and the EU and their sundry crimes. This is a very good point. I wanted to make it in my monologue, but I didn't have the time left to do so. None of you, as I said, just touching on 4 million people watched Mother of all talk shows in the last 7 days. And that's a very, very, very sizable audience, but it's a drop in the ocean compared with the general public as a whole, even just in the United Kingdom, never mind across the Western world. Do not underestimate the number of people who've been fooled and who remain fooled. If I was in any danger of underestimating it, it didn't survive the reaction from people that I thought like me, that are not in my circle but tangential to my life, a week past Saturday, when, to my astonishment, the first 2 people that I spoke to were filled with curses about Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and tears of sympathy for Zelensky. Do not underestimate how many sheep there are. And even though at least one of those 2 knows that the very same governments and media outlets have been lying through their teeth about Gaza for 14 or 15 months, he was still ready to believe them on Ukraine. These people have lied to you about everything, from JFK until now, through everything, through all the assassinations, all the wars, all the pandemics, all the crimes. They've lied to you, and you know that they have lied to you, but you're ready to believe them on Syria? You're ready to believe them on Ukraine? Do you need help somehow? Well, it definitely does benefit them, and there's never any murder and mayhem from them on the streets of Israel, though there frequently has been on the streets of Germany and France and London and so on. So it all does make you wonder who ISIS, who Al-Qaeda really are, really were, who really are at their core. But there's no doubt that their message of extreme fanaticism and sectarian hatred and bloodlust and death cult has attracted a very significant number of Muslims around the world. That's why people went to Syria from all parts of the world to form part of the ISIS and Al-Qaeda army. We fear these people at home, but we are quite happy to give them knives and weapons and money if they go to a place and fight someone of whom we officially disapprove. And that's exactly what has happened. I understood that as a cat's paw tactic, but I simply don't understand why you would want to actually help them so much that they win. Now that they have state power, they can only shame you. They would shame the devils in hell with their conduct since coming to power, and especially in the last weeks. I mean, no wonder David Lammy hasn't said anything yet, because only last week he gave them £50 million of British public money. And this week, they shame him, if shame is something he's capable of, by demonstrating through the lenses of their own cameras what it is that they are doing with the 50 million. And of course, like Frankenstein, this monster might get out of control. Let's start with the bizarre series of security incidents in Washington over the last couple of days. I don't know about you, but they've got me on edge. What would you say about them?
I've been on edge ever since Butler, Pennsylvania, for that first shot where Trump says that God said, "Donald, duck." And of course he ducked, and of course the bullet went through his ear. There are people out to get him. I've been suggesting that he make sure that his tasters in the White House dining hall, and not only there, but at the FBI and at the Director of National Intelligence, that those people always taste the food. There's lots of people in the deep state that would like to have Trump gone because they are very vulnerable. They have not been held accountable for what they did to Trump in his first 4 years, and how they did everything they could to prevent him from being elected in 2016, where they failed, but in 2020 as well, where they didn't fail. In other words, they didn't disrupt. Well, Biden won, and that was our problem.
The incident with the vice president astonished me, Ray. It cannot be the case, surely, that the vice president of the United States, a particularly potent one, I think, one that one could easily see as president of the United States, it surely can't be the case that he's walking around in public with his small children, is it?
It's really up to him, George. The Secret Service is supposed to be surrounding him, particularly these days, but you can't turn down a vice president who wants to take a walk. The issue here is how loyal the Secret Service is to the president or to the vice president. There's a lot of residue. And when John F. Kennedy was killed, parts of the Secret Service were involved. So unless Trump can clean house in a way that hasn't been done in many, many years, he's vulnerable until he puts his foot down and makes sure that not only he has the authority, but he can enforce it by loyal people.